Hello, everyone. So this is the first lecture that I'm giving you on bio-inspired materials. So I am going to share with you my screen. This is basically the presentation that I have already given you. The subject of this lecture and several other lectures that you will have right after this is bio-inspired materials and biological materials. Basically, the main question I'm posing and I'm trying to answer, and obviously this can go for many semesters, but we're just confining it to equivalent to 2 to 3 weeks of lectures, is what can we learn from, what is in nature to be learned from that we can implement in our engineering materials. In particular, there are two aspects that I am going to discuss in nature materials. So the first aspect is what I would call elements of design. So why are certain elements in nature materials are certain dimensions? And I will explain that in a minute. And the other aspect of it is this bottom one is multifunctionalities that we can learn from nature. To understand the first part, I want you to pay attention to this figure that you see here. So it's actually two figures that are drawn side by side, and what you have in them is toughness, fracture toughness, as a function of Young's modulus. We can also plot fracture toughness as a function of strength. You get pretty much a similar qualitative behavior that I'm about to tell you. There are two types of materials that I've explained here: engineering materials and biological materials. Engineering materials such as metals, composites, ceramics, and biological materials such as our bones, the proteins in spider silk and things like that. What I want you to pay attention to is that both these curves have the so-called banana shape. I'll draw the banana for you. This is the banana here. And if you look at this banana, the more we move in the diagonal direction, the more we're getting both toughness and stiffness. In other words, in biological materials, somehow it doesn't seem that getting toughness comes at the cost of a stiffness. You can have both, you can improve both of them. But when you look at engineering materials, you kind of see this inverse banana. It's still banana, but inverse relative to the first one. So here, for instance, I have high toughness, but low modulus. Here I have high, or here I have high modulus, but low toughness. So clearly, nature does it in a way that the two properties are not compromised, and we want to learn from that. And the way we do things is that is compromised. So now, in order to understand this effect, I want you to pay attention to the next slide, which is here. Let me put my, okay. So before I go to nature materials, I want you to pay attention to a few things here. This building block is what we call brick and mortar, brick and mortar. These are bricks. This is just like a brick wall. And the white parts in between the bricks is actually the mortar, is the glue that is keeping all of this together. Now, imagine the bricks are very brittle, are strong. The strength and stiffness of the material comes from these bricks, but they have low toughness. On the other hand, these the interface, the mortar that's in between them, is something that carries load from one brick to another through shear. If I look at the building block of this guy, the width of each, the thickness, the width of each brick is 2b. The building block, because of symmetry, I just consider half of the brick, so the thickness is b. the width is B, I'm sorry, and thickness in all of this structure is 1. It's through the plane. So thickness is through the plane. So if I apply a sigma 0 to one tablet, or brick, tablet or brick, it goes through this mortar to the other tablet or brick. So basically, the bricks are axially carrying the load, or are carrying the load axially primarily. It's an approximation of reality. And the mortar is carrying the load in shear. Now, this is an approximation, and it will be true if L, the length, is much, much larger than B. So L is much, much larger than B. Now, if you look at nature materials, the bottom one is if you look at this graph here, millimeter, micrometer, nanometer, these are length scales. The column C, the row C is a spider silk. If I look at the smallest building block, I see these beta sheets, which are, I'm just putting stars on top of them. These are stiff components, which are, the load is transferred between them by this mortar, which is I'm showing with the star. Now, this mortar in this case is nothing, it's just hydrogen bonds, but it's a mechanism for shear load transfer. So that's exactly what we have here and here and here. Now, if you look at slightly larger length scales in our own bones, you still see these these stiff components, and that they are transferring load through this hydrogen bonds that I'm showing with X. Slightly larger length scale, but similar microstructure. Now, if you look at abalone shell, if you look at, this is much longer length scales, a few orders of magnitude, 2 or 3 orders of magnitude longer. Here, the white stuff is actually a biopolymer. And the black stuff is actually a mineral, which is, we can classify it as a ceramic. It's a brittle material. So my point is, this type of building block that you see here repeats itself in nature in various length scales. The nature of interactions change, like it could be van der Waals interaction, it could be a polymer that is binding the two, it could be hydrogen bonds, it could be any sort of dispersive bond. But what doesn't change in any of them is the fact that load is transferred primarily through shear from one to the other. So I'm going to pause this video here, and then I'm going to continue with this building block that I have here on a PDF file that I separately sent you, that is handwritten notes. So let me stop sharing, and I am going to